Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of House Chronicle. At this program, we believe that what the government does at all levels is important, not just what happens in the White House, but what happens in the agencies of government. Today, we're taking a look at a particular disease and the new role with additional funding that one of the agencies of government, the National Institutes of Health, is beginning to play. The disease is myalgic encephalomyelitis. You probably know it as chronic fatigue syndrome. Sometimes they're jammed together. It is a particularly ghastly, awful, dreadful disease which takes away the life from people, puts them, I don't know, into some kind of suspense, into some parallel existence where they hurt, where they're fatigued, where they sleep without getting refreshment from sleep, where they cannot participate in normal activities. A friend of mine just went to a conference in Las Vegas and slept for a week afterwards. She suffers from this disease. It confiscates life. It breaks up families. It breaks up relationships. And they go on year in, year out, unable to work, unable to participate, and yet alive, and sometimes looking surprisingly healthy. As a consequence, many of the sufferers are not treated well by their families, who think that maybe they're malingering, maybe they are not really sick. They are deeply, terribly, seriously sick. To look at this disease and new developments at the National Institutes of Health, which comprises 27 institutes in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of Washington, we have two very distinguished physicians, one with NIH and one with a foundation which seeks to raise money and to procure research into myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, usually called these days MECFS. Today I'm joined by Dr. Walter Koroshetz, Director, National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, also known as NIDS. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you very much.
And by Dr. Zaher Nahle, Chief Scientific Officer and Vice President for Research at the SMCI, which stands for?
The Solve MECFS Initiative.
Solve MECFS Initiative.
Based in Los Angeles.
Both welcome to the broadcast. Dr. Koroshetz, there's been some movement at NIH, which has always been rather, how can I say it, hasn't been that enthusiastic in funding about this disease. Suddenly there's some real money, and you're setting up some research centers around the country, 4 of them I understand. Could you explain what has happened and how they're being funded?
Sure thing. So Dr. Francis Collins, who's my boss, the NIH director, made a commitment to put the NIH resources behind trying to discover some of these mysteries underlying MECFS, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome. And so there's a trans NIH group which includes 25 different institutes and centers, and we get back to why there are so many there, which got together and had brainstormed about how we can move the research forward. And we thought that a consortium of sites working to try and solve problems in MECFS individually but as a group would be the best way to get things started. So that is the reasoning behind the centers.
The Solve Myalgic Encephalomyelitis Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Initiative, where does that fit in?
Well, we fit in on so many levels.
That is not part of NIH. That is a freestanding,
yes,
California-based
right. We are a nonprofit
foundation.
organization. We are a nonprofit research organization, disease organization. We do research, we do advocacy, we support seed funding for investigators to eventually get to the point where they can submit NIH grants and get their independent funding from the NIH. We also do a variety of things. We do investments in knowledge gap in MECFS. We are only focused on MECFS. We also conduct conferences and think tanks and discovery forums. So we are in this disease space. We also do advocacy work with the NIH, with the CDC, and with the government on all fronts. We are very privileged, Llewellyn, to be part of many of the applications that were submitted to the NIH. We are co-investigators on the Data Management and Coordinating Center, and also partners in 7 out of the 10 applications that went out. So we are part in that space as a facilitator, as disruptor, so that we can assist the NIH and all other parties willing to advance the field.
Dr. Koroshetz, historically, there's been a tendency to identify this disease as being psychological, as being not a real disease, but that is now gone.
It's pretty clear that the patients who are suffering from this illness are severely disabled, and they have a host of biological abnormalities. And so yes, this disease has a biological basis. The trouble is we don't actually know what is the unifying biology behind the disease. So in that sense, there's a big mystery out there to be uncovered.
In other words, you can't go to a doctor and he can't give you a test and say to you, you definitely have myalgic encephalomyelitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome.
That's correct. It's a syndrome that there are certain characteristics of patients who fit this category of ME/CFS. I would say everyone's not the same, so there are different variations in the way people present and the troubles that they have. And because there isn't, a single test, it's difficult diagnostically, I'm sure. But there are many other syndromes in medicine over the years that have fallen to the biology once we understand it.
Give us an example of where we've seen that sort of thing.
Well, in my experience, I would say conditions such as mitochondrial disorders are very, very difficult to diagnose. Patients present with a variety of different symptoms, and it was really the genetics, finding the mutations in the mitochondria, that allowed folks to make that next step to make the diagnosis, split the diseases into categories.
In layman's terms, what is that disease?
Well, mitochondrial disorders there are a host of disorders. There might be 50 of them, and they affect.
For example,
the mitochondria are the energy-producing factories inside the cells. So you can imagine if you have trouble for the cell producing energy, if it's your muscle cell, you're going to be weak. It's your nerve cell, you're going to get what's called a neuropathy. If it's in the brain, you can get severe brain injury.
Do we now have biomarkers for that?
We have genetics for that. It's still a tough one because there are so many different ways in which people present. But it's something that I bring up because in ME/CFS, the question is, people become incredibly disabled after exercise. And it's not just like you and I, when we exercise, we're beat, and the next day we wake up and we're fine, maybe a couple aches and pains at my age, but folks will be wrecked for weeks.
The pace has picked up in the last 5 years. What accounts for that?
Today there's great hope, and the outlooks on ME/CFS has dramatically changed. And the reason for that, Llewellyn, is a number of things. Is the commitment, number one, that Dr. Francis Collins made 2 years ago. In fact, in October, he came out with a press release announcing that one of the many mysterious illnesses that science has yet to unravel, ME/CFS, is the most challenging. The most challenging. Now, this is the head of the NIH, and of course, Dr. Koroshetz has been leading the charge on this. The NIH has done a series of steps, practical steps that did not exist 5 years ago, like establishing the intramural, forgive me for listing those, I'm not here in that capacity, but the establishment of the intramural study on the NIH ground for the first time in history, dedicated for ME/CFS. And then supplemental awards for certain investigators who already have R01 grants or federally funded. Then a request for information from the public so that the public and the scientific community can input and provide their opinions and provide their needs and requests to the NIH. Then a common data element projects between the CDC and the NIH, which is a major development in my opinion, because now we are comparing different studies, like comparing apples and oranges. Common data elements, these are essential metrics that exist for any disease. Language that allows you to compare data with fidelity to now what Dr. Koroshetz mentioned, the announcement of the consortium. This is one policy element that contributed to the change. But I also, let me give you briefly another element, and that is the advancement of technology. Now we are doing high throughput analysis that are more readily available than a long time ago. And these, whether it's lipidomics, whether it's metabolomics, whether it's genomics, whether it's immune surveillance at the massive level as a simultaneous readout, are showing us now that the abnormalities in this disease, the physiological abnormalities, cannot be ignored anymore. They are popping up in a variety of arenas. And also, quite frankly, work like organizations like ours that is so focused on ME/CFS and trying to move the needle and advance the field. I would say these three elements.
There are a lot of diseases that need a lot of study. How does NIH pick between them? I mean, they all have lobbies, they all have a terrible sense of urgency, and NIH is the place they come for research, and that depends to some extent on money available, appropriated by the Congress, and in some ways assigned by NIH itself, the National Institutes of Health. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's a really tough question. I could say that everyone you ask will give you a different opinion. So my sense is that NIH is a granting agency, and the core of NIH is this very American process of jury by your peers. So the vast majority of NIH funds go to grants that come in and get reviewed and get a score that is highly meritorious. And then the institutes who have funds start paying the grants with the best scores until they run out of money. And that's what we do in our institute. So the process is very much bottom up and not very much top down.
How will you apply that process to ME/CFS?
We see very few applications. And
that's a problem, isn't it?
That's a problem. And that's why got Dr. Collins to kind of pull the trigger on putting particular money, not really to solve we don't think that this amount of money is going to solve the problem. We hope is that this...
It's fairly modest, isn't it? It's what, about $15 million, somewhere around there?
It's about, I think it's 7 million. 7 million a year for 5 years, so 35 million. But the key thing is that we think if we can start these consortia, then that is seeding the research landscape. And the hope is that this will bring in more people from the centers, but outside the center. I'd say also, so there's 4 centers in the program, but each of those centers is associated usually with 4 or 5 other hospitals or clinics. So it's 4 times 5 in terms of its spread. But we definitely need people to come into this field to try and crack this mystery. This is not going to be easy, and this is going to take real hard work and a stroke of genius and a lot of luck, I think.
Is there anything, either of you, anything that typifies a researcher in this field? And how can you attract talent to go after this disease? There are maybe 1 million people, maybe more, suffering every day.
Why don't you start? Because I think the organization like yourselves has tremendous convening power and motivating power.
Yeah, absolutely, and we try to do that. We try to bring new talent to the field. But let me give you real examples from folks who talk to us. There is a student, a graduate student, who's doing his thesis on ME/CFS in one of the major universities. And he tells me that when they have their departmental meeting, they make fun of him sometimes because he's not working on the fancy diseases. Now, we don't believe that there is a disease that has a higher moral platitude than any other disease. But it is the commitment from the NIH, it's investment that is serious and that is tractable from the NIH, from other institutions, that will allow that individual to hold his head high and doing one of the most exciting work in ME/CFS. ME/CFS is one of those diseases at the intersection of neuroendocrine biology, of immunity and inflammation, of bioenergetic system defects. So when it comes to curiosity about science and about investigation, this is a prime model for study. Let me give you another example, Llewellyn, from a professor. I gave you a junior budding talent. Let me give you a professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, without mentioning name. He told me personally that he now has to keep one foot in seeing patients with infection arenas and one in ME/CFS because his institution will not support him if he only does ME/CFS. These are real issues that we have to confront. And the way I think we confront them is by investing in this field as much as we can, because we are operating with a 30-40-year deficit. That's why the problem is so huge right now. The centers, I think the commitment from the centers is commensurate with other centers in terms of funding. But the reason we are seeing this appetite and need is because the problem has been neglected for a long, long time. We also need to establish major national programs like the Common Data Element Program, like the National Registry that organizations like us is taking a lead on, which is very important for understanding, Llewellyn, what we call the natural history of the disease. In fact, the Institute of Medicine report marked that point.
We pause for station identification, primarily for our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, the POTUS channel 124, where this program can be heard 3 times every weekend. This program can also be seen on 200 US television stations and around the globe on the Voice of America television, and it can be heard there on radio as well. You are listening to White House Chronicle with myself, Llewellyn King, and our guests as introduced. It seems to me that there are some relationship to what happened with AIDS. First of all, nobody understood it. There was a lot of suspicion of people with it, that they had somehow done something unspeakable and deserved it. And it really took celebrities, to Elizabeth Taylor comes to mind, to draw attention and to be recognized as a disease that affected all segments of the community, and tremendous work was done, and AIDS is at bay, if not cured today. What do you see there that NIH has learned that could be applied to ME?
Well, I would say that, so I run the Neurological Institute, and we have 400 different diseases. I would say, just off the bat, top of my head, 50% are fatal and have no treatments. So for me, ME/CFS is a really bad problem, but there are lots of really bad problems, and we need people working on them, and we don't know where the discovery is going to come from. You know, the discovery that solves ME/CFS could come from multiple sclerosis research. It could come from infectious disease research. So right now with ME/CFS, the difference between AIDS and ME/CFS is that AIDS, they identified the virus. Once we can put our hands on what the inciting event is, then I think that will bring people to the field. In many fields that I've been in, when it's not clear where you can kind of put your landing zone, where's your beachhead from which to build your research out, as Zain mentioned, a lot of people are not going to go into that field, or they're going to struggle, or they're going to fail. It's very high risk. So to be able to get that beachhead and really understand something that we can really trust is essential to the condition biologically, that I think will bring people
across
into the
the
field.
board. What brings people into research programs? What are the qualities that make a researcher, and how do you keep her or him at work and satisfied? I have seen in other areas, in engineering and science, where there have been government programs, huge enthusiasm, people have thrown their lives into them, bang, the money stopped, the program's abandoned, the life is destroyed, and these people never get the same passion for something else. How do you bring passionate researchers into these diseases to make a life's career of it?
Well, I think that the difference between the medical field and some of the engineering fields is the engineering field, you can say, oh, you know, we're not doing that anymore. The medical field, the problems don't go away. So the problem is always there staring at you. What you need is people who become passionate about a disease. And that can happen in many ways. But I think, you know, Solve ME/CFS and groups like that have the real ability to touch somebody, and especially a young person, and convert them to become a champion. I think a lot of physician scientists out there, they're looking to really make a difference in the world, and they would like, you know, a disease like this to capture their attention. But the risk is, how do I know if I go into this field I'm actually going to come out with something? And that's where I think we're struggling. As I mentioned, we're 50 years behind. I would say, he mentioned, it's interesting that, so my mentor in the 50s had this idea that blockage of the carotid artery caused stroke. And his boss told him he was wasting his time. And he threw him out, and he left, and he went to Boston, and he kept working on it, and he became the greatest stroke scientist in the world, because he didn't listen to these people.
This is always happening. It's not
always happening.
It's not just as a eureka moment. You've got to have somebody who believes in the eureka discovery. And we see this in Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath. There was a fellow in a cancer ward in New York for children, and he was appalled at the suffering. And the orthodoxy said you could only administer one medicine at a time. He said, they're suffering so much and they're going to die, why don't we try a cocktail? And now cocktails are accepted treatment for cancer.
Combination therapy.
And for AIDS, correct?
Correct. Llewellyn, if I may circle back on this point of exciting folks out there. Now, 50% of the applicants we get for our small, seed grant program are new to the field, and we are very excited about that. I mean, this is the pipeline. It's always the curiosity. It's always what is for scientists, and I myself, I am a scientist. It's always what's behind the mountain. It's that drive. It's that curiosity. But there's another practical element to exciting people to enter the ME/CFS research. Usually, folks beyond the curiosity get excited because either a family member is sick with a disease, or they have been taught in school, in graduate schools or medical school, about it by a charming or influencing professor. The point I'm trying to make here is 1/3 of medical school curricula in the United States, and let alone abroad, do not teach ME/CFS in their curricula. So we are losing a big chunk of future scientists and physicians and who will get excited at these formative stages in their career. God knows I became excited about one field of biology during that phase myself, and I followed it. So it is a combination of things. It's policy, science policy, medical education, investment in research. Again, as someone who had to compete for a tenure track faculty positions in my life, you submit a proposal to the search committee. Now, it's expected that now we are getting to the nuances of science management, but it is expected that after your startup package, or what the institution helps you to get started, it's expected that you support your funding independently. What they mean by that is funding from the NIH. And unless we have a tractable career path, a realistic career path from independent sources of funding, there is no search committees who will make that decision to sponsor junior faculty just for ME/CFS. So it's an interconnected problem here.
We talk about research, but what does the researcher do? if you're watching this on television, you may wonder, are they in white coats at benches? Are they poring over computer screens?
You need people who are interacting with the patients, who are seeing patterns in how the patients present. So there's syndromic classification. And physicians will always try to improve the lot of their patients. So there's a lot of experimentation going on, quote unquote experimentation, because a doctor's trying something to make the patient better. And sometimes that is what leads to a discovery. And then the big question is, is there some kind of infectious illness that starts off the process? So one area which is probably the most studied is post-Lyme disease. So Lyme disease, as you know, is an infection transmitted by the deer tick, and it causes, like many infections, severe fatigue. But some people never actually improve. And what is the underpinning there? We don't see any evidence of infection, but the fatigue continues. So we wonder, a lot of people wonder whether that's what is occurring in ME/CFS.
So it's a legacy of fatigue, if you will.
That's one possibility, but there are a lot of people trying to look at that problem right now. Right.
Where do some of the others that have been mentioned often come out in discussions, like military diseases, post
exposures,
exposures,
toxins,
etc. Do those all fit in? Are they all possible culprits as triggers of ME?
Well, I think that is a big question about whether ME/CFS is one thing or it's many things. That's why I brought up this mitochondrial condition where you have multiple different mutations and they all cause something a little bit different, but they're all related to the mitochondria. So are there differences like that, some due to toxins? There's even a condition that occurs in athletes who do very extensive aerobic exercise, very extensive exercise, and then they quote unquote hit a wall, and they also develop severe fatigue and exhaustion for months afterwards. So there are these other kind of conditions which simulate what we call ME/CFS, but ME/CFS could be a conglomeration of multiple different things. And if we're going to find a cause or a treatment, we're going to have to subdivide all the different types.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the data out there is showing us that ME/CFS is really a multifactorial type disease.
Does that mean it's like cancer, where there are many cancers?
Cancer is a chronic disease, and there are different subtypes and subgroups, and even within breast cancer, we have different breast cancers. So it's not unlikely that we see something like this here. The data now is showing us again that the abnormalities exist on so many levels. At the level of the microbiome, the gut-brain axis, at the level of energy system defects, whether enzymes in certain systems. We don't know the exact culprit. At the level of viruses and pathogens, that could be triggers, and also potentially genetic predisposition. So what we need is what Dr. Koroshetz said.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you for your wisdom and patience. Thank you.